Hi, everybody. Welcome to another video lecture series. This one is going to be fun because we finally get to talk about the Renaissance. So welcome to the Renaissance at last. We've been leading up to it in part because views about the Renaissance have tended to define views about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages has been seen as a time that's not quite as good as the Renaissance. We called a lot of that into question. We talked about some of the things that were good in the Middle Ages. But one author I know described the Renaissance as having a crisis of needing to be the awesomest, and I think that's got a flavor of truth to it. That this is a time period where people begin sort of rethinking who they are, and they rethink themselves in contrast to previous generation or previous centuries of existence, such as in the Middle Ages. Now, that said, they haven't quite, a lot of us talking about this Renaissance time period is looking backwards. This is a name that almost like it's a couple centuries later that people really are the most excited about the Renaissance because they see it as the time period that leads to their own. In the 1700s and the 1800s, they're talking it up as this is the key to figuring out who we are and, and the key to leading to all the things that we value. During the actual time period, it isn't as clear that they actually knew that they were going for that sort of long-term trajectory there. And so one question about the Renaissance is how did they see themselves? So we'll talk about that. But the Renaissance, yeah, we've discussed the Renaissance a lot in the context of the Middle Ages. I don't think either one is necessarily worse. I think it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. And the things that people have seen as the shortcomings of the Middle Ages, not as much emphasis on writing and knowledge, and maybe when there is emphasis on writing and knowledge, there's too much of an emphasis on God, things like that. That's the sort of idea that people have, and I think there's some truth in that. In contrast, in the time period of the Renaissance itself, the focus is less on God and more on how do we figure things out? How do we figure out the best way to live? That's the real big theme here. And the question I want to ask is why? Why did this become the theme that everyone was talking about during this time period? And I say everyone, but who specifically was pursuing that theme of, making things better, leading to better ways of understanding society, understanding human beings. We talk about, there's an idea called humanism. And the idea of humanism is basically the study of human beings and sort of the quest to make human beings and human life better. That's humanism. And fans of humanism really do tend to point to the Renaissance as the time period where that kicks off. Kind of to the Greeks and Romans as well, having ideas about, Socrates says, how should we run a city and things like that. And then the idea basically is that in the Renaissance, they picked that thread back up again, where it was a thread that was kind of dropped. Now, the thing is, in the Renaissance, they didn't use the term humanism or humanist, scholar of humanism. They didn't have that concept. It's later generations that tend to look back and see those things there. So let's keep that in mind. But I think you can make a fair argument that these are the kinds of things that people are interested in during the time. How do we run a city? How do we run a society? How should human life be lived? Not just in the context of God, because in the Middle Ages, it was all in the context of God. People weren't necessarily not interested in the questions of how do you live a good life, but it was always important to think about, well, ultimately, it's about going to heaven, it's about following religion, things like that. And so everything else is within that context. But during the Renaissance, it's not that they stop being religious completely, it's that they start thinking about it outside of that context. I think that's the best way to think about it. Okay, but who really led the Renaissance? Where did it come from and why did it happen exactly? I think the big group that we have to turn to is the city-states of Italy. So Italy, pretty significant place, also the region of the Roman Empire. And so we have Rome, and so we have the Pope living in what's known as the Papal State. Like I said, in this time period, the Pope has armies in a way that he doesn't today. And Rome had territory that was controlling. But it was not the only territory in this region. We also had many other city-states in Italy. And a city-state is basically, just a city that runs itself as its own government. It's not part of a greater country, but it's part of its own, it is its own sort of territory. Now, city-states can spread out and take over other city-states. So in practice, they can sort of become the seats of governments. But what we had here originally, if we think back to maybe the end of the 1300s or the start of the 1400s, we didn't have territory that was as well defined as this. What we had was a bunch of cities that were growing richer and richer and growing more and more powerful. And we also had the Pope as well. But one thing we talked about was sort of the decline of the traditional religion last time in our sort of transitional period there. And that leading to the Avignon papacy, where the Pope was no longer operating out of Rome. Later on, they try to bring the Pope back to Rome, and then there's 2 popes, and then there's 3 popes, until finally the whole multiple popes situation is resolved. But all that means that this sort of leader operating out of Rome is no longer able to kind of boss around these other city-states and tell them what to do. And so these city-states enjoy this long period where they can grow and be independent of any outside control. They're also outside the control of the new Holy Roman Emperor, a guy in the 1100s called Barbarossa, and they're outside of the control of the King of France, who tries to sort of take them over in the 1300s, a guy called Philip. So altogether, these different city-states have managed a rare feat, which is to be independent. And we're still coming out of this sort of medieval structure of, the serfs owe their loyalty to the knights and the knights owe their loyalty to the kings. These city-states, they don't play by those rules because they are part of the sort of 4th group in the Middle Ages, which is the middle class who are making money. So in the cities, people were making more and more money, and the cities were growing, and you eventually ended up with people who didn't fit anywhere in the feudal system, these merchants who were living what we would think of as middle-class lives. And they were doing this by like buying and selling wool and dye and resources and things like that. They had made themselves basically businessmen. And they were also bankers. Mostly it was Jews who were bankers, but Christians were trying to figure out ways to cheat the system or to have Jewish people who worked for them so that they could cheat the system. Even though Christians were not supposed to be bankers, they still tried to do that anyway. And so that's the sort of situation in the 1200s and the 1300s. And these cities all throughout Europe are growing bigger and bigger all the time. But these ones right here in Italy, they have a chance to be independent and to kind of determine their own destiny. So what we see in these independent city-states is that they grow to the point where it's not the middle class we're talking about anymore. It's not like there's just some people who are well off in town, but they're still loyal to a king. They are the powerful. We go from the middle class merchants to the upper class merchants to rich aristocrats, but self-made aristocrats. They are making money not because, they're related to any kings, but because they're buying and selling a whole lot of wool. And part of this is due to the fact that they control the guilds. So guilds were an institution throughout the Middle Ages. This idea basically, but especially more and more as the towns grew, this idea that there would be a group among a certain profession, like say stonemasons. We still have Masonic guilds today. It's a little bit different, but say it's all the people who are stoneworkers. They get together in this guild and they decide who is going to, what are the right ways to cut stone? How do you do a good job? They enforce the standards so you don't get crappy stonework. And so then the stonemasons, they have this group called the Stonemasons Guild or the Masons Guild. And then anybody who tries to be a stonemason who's not part of that group, they, can deprive them of resources, say, we're keeping all this stuff for ourselves, or they can say, hey, don't use this guy. He's not part of the guild. His work isn't good enough. So in practice, most people would tend to join the guilds. Now, that said, it could be very competitive getting these positions. In theory, you're supposed to start off as an apprentice and then become a journeyman and eventually become a master. But there were a very limited number of master positions, so there was a lot of control going on. They could keep people kind of at the apprentice and journeyman positions, the people who were in the biggest position of power. In this time period, these guilds became connected to powerful families. And so things like the wool workers, it wasn't about, your skill at wool anymore. It was about how much were you connected to, say, the Medici family or some family like that. So these families were running the show, and they were rich families. But that said, they had a different set of goals than your sort of knights and kings from back in the day. And this is important. For the first time, they could kind of compete with the knights and kings and keep from getting taken over. Now, how could you do that? Because the king has this whole army, and the knights each have their army of peasants that they bring together. Well, the merchants could do something better. They could hire mercenaries. So we've got guilds and we've got mercenaries. So this is pretty genius, actually. These guys had a lot of money, so they would just pay a group of people to fight for them. And pretty soon, there were lots of groups such as this, led by mercenary captains who were leading their own sort of independent armies who just fought for the highest bidder. And part of the reason this is so genius is because people who their whole profession and career is fighting are much better fighters than people who are just conscripted into it like a bunch of random peasants. This is the sort of distinction between soldiers, that being the peasants, and like warriors whose war is their whole way of life. Those type of people tend to be better at fighting. So not only could the city-states fight kings and knights, they could also be better than them because their armies were better by and large. Now, they started at a bit of a disadvantage, but this is part of how they managed to hold off the French king. And then more and more over time, they just kept going further and further down this path and getting stronger and stronger. So it shouldn't be surprising that after a certain point, they began fighting each other. So some of the city-states managed to take over the others and make them bow down to them. And while England and France were having their 100 Years' War, Italy was kind of having its 100 Years' War of its own, with these city-states competing for power. Eventually, you ended up with a few really big ones. Venice over here, you may know Venice for being a beautiful canal city. Part of how it got so beautiful is being a rich city that had a lot of power. Milan was another one. Florence was pretty good. These guys were big bankers, and they did this by basically pretending their loans weren't loans. It was like converting money for somebody or something. They found lots of ways to cheat the idea that Christians shouldn't be bankers. And you had the Pope, of course, but he was a less important presence as time went on. He came back in more later on in the 1400s. But after the schism was over. But for the time period of the schism, he was a lesser player. And then finally, you have Naples and Sicily. Naples, originally a Greek word meaning new city, it's down here in the south of Italy. And these guys were powerful, but they kind of buffered by the papal states. So they kind of stayed out of the business of these northern ones. And there was other ones like Genoa and Corsica and Savoy, that kept getting in and out of these power struggles. So it was always changing. So it wasn't static, but these were the major players. And these are the cities where you see the most Renaissance art and the most beautiful sort of works of art and knowledge and literature that we've come to associate with Renaissance, because these were the guys who were paying. But it goes even deeper than that, because the rich families, they wanted to present themselves as being good, positive leadership for their particular cities. And they focused on this idea of virtù. Let's see, I think I have it on a slide here. Okay, yes. So this was particularly the idea of a guy called Alberti, who we're going to meet him and see some of his architecture later on. But virtu should not be translated simply as virtue. It's not quite the same thing. Imagine if sort of the concept of virtue also had a connotation of like courage and manliness, and also beauty and nobility. That might kind of get at the concept that we're trying to get at here. So this idea of virtu was very important to all these guys. And so they're trying to outdo each other. The rich people are trying to outdo each other in virtue and get what, the people on their side by saying, I am the best leader. I am the most courageous and brave and noble and manly leader. And I create the most beautiful works of art by hiring artists to create the most beautiful works of art. That's sort of the competitive process that we've got going on here. So all of this is very much leading us towards a place where there's going to be a lot of cool art and a lot of new ideas. And in part, this is just the logistics of how the nature of power worked. But there was also a change in the way that people were thinking. So let's talk about that. One of the big factors is the printing press. And I decided not to go into the video on here because it's hard to do video over Zoom recording. But if you want to look up there's a great video about the printing press on the Front Range Films on Demand website. But Gutenberg is, so you've probably heard about Gutenberg before, the inventor of the printing press. Now, there had been printing presses in China, more or less. This was woodblock printing, where you have different letters for each Chinese character. In the West, when it was invented, it came along at a similar time, not too long later. Don't know if there was any direct influence there. Maybe not, but it seemed like an idea whose time had come. And it was actually easier in Europe, in Germany, because you only had 26 letters. So all you had to do was have lots of copies of those 26 letters instead of having to have like a unique one for every Chinese character. And so this was the invention of type, and type being these sort of blocks of letters you could move around and arrange in certain ways. It evolved so that there was italic type, which was all slanted and was used for emphasis. And then the other kind was just called, Roman type. Which is where we get Times New Roman. All of our font-related stuff goes back to the printing press if you go far back enough. But the impact of the printing press cannot be overstated because, and you may have heard about this before, back in the Middle Ages, to create a new copy of a book, you literally had to copy the book. This is why monks spent so much of their time copying books, because they were the ones who cared the most about knowledge, and they had to just literally write it out by hand all over again. And if there was an illustration, they had to redo the illustration. Gutenberg changed all that. Now you could make multiple copies of a book. All you had to do was just print it in the printing press multiple times. And so the very first thing he created was a copy of the Bible, naturally, the Gutenberg Bible. And this is going to be instrumental, actually, when the Protestant Reformation comes rolling around to spread new copies of the Bible. But this is also a way you could spread messages. You could spread books on all sorts of subjects. You could have a play and then read the play after it had been performed, which is pretty amazing. All sorts of things could have records and last long term, and have this sort of long-term knowledge be spread far and wide. So this is a time period when knowledge could really, really travel, really much faster than it had before. It was just so much easier to make copies of letters and books and things. And so this was an instrumental part in the development of new philosophies. It really helped to be able to communicate ideas to other people. And I think that's part of why the Middle Ages doesn't seem to change a whole lot, except over the course of maybe centuries, whereas the Renaissance is a time period of lots of change, because change can happen so much faster when ideas can spread a whole lot faster. Okay, but let's get back to the ideas of the Renaissance. So like I said, this is the idea of humanism, the caring about human beings as a particular field of study, and also this idea of like wanting to enhance human beings, wanting to make human beings better. But the interesting thing about the way these Renaissance scholars who had this mentality, and remember, they didn't have the word humanism themselves, the interesting thing about these scholars is that they didn't see it as like moving forward into the future. They saw it as going back to the past, in part because the future was generally seen as a sign of things getting worse. You didn't want to change things too much because in all likelihood, it would be changing them for the worse. That was sort of the common mentality at the time. But people did remember in the distant past this Roman Empire and the Greek and Roman knowledge. And that was seen as good. That was seen as coming from kind of a golden age where people had things figured out, especially more and more. There was never really a time period where the church rejected it during the Middle Ages, Greek and Roman stuff. Sometimes we tend to think that it was, but it really wasn't like that. It was more that the church only thought about it in the context of Christianity, in the context of God. And these scholars were starting to explore it for its own sake. And so in a way, humanism can be interpreted as the study of Greek and Roman texts, or Greek and Latin writing. And so humanists would learn Greek and Latin. Now, this was something that priests had done during the Middle Ages, and probably some kings as well, maybe even some knights. But now we have this aristocracy that is not really connected to knighthood or anything like that. And of course, they all want to learn it. And so this knowledge is going to be popular among them. And there's certain ideas of what you should study that are sort of ideas of like, this will improve a human being. You should study grammar. This is just basically so you can learn the languages. Rhetoric, how to convince people. You should study history. You should study poetry, how to make beautiful poems. And you should study moral philosophy, how to be good. And so these humanists were quite rational. They hoped that humans could meet their potential by learning all these things that were part of this lost knowledge. And so they didn't really see themselves as a rebirth or a reawakening. They saw themselves as just people who were looking back to a distant past that they had declined from. And they were hoping that they could learn something from that past. So probably the first guy that people usually start out with when they're talking about humanism is Petrarch. Petrarch was a guy who was obsessed with collecting Latin texts. He really was frustrated by the amount of knowledge that was no longer accessible. So he did a lot of work to roam around and to collect these texts from monasteries and to make copies of them. And he was, coming along in the late 1200s, early 1300s. So he's right at the start of our Renaissance in our transitional period. And he really did believe that people could have the knowledge that was in these texts once more. But he wasn't sort of thinking of the future. He was thinking of returning to what had worked in the past. He's also one of the writers of love poetry. He was a poet himself. He had his love poetry is a little weird because it's a girl that he never actually spent all that much time with. This is actually a thing. This was true with Dante too. He wrote about a woman he never spent all that much time with. And maybe we think that's kind of weird. Maybe the best possible interpretation of it is that he doesn't see her as he sees her as more of a symbol than the actuality. So he sees her as a symbolic sort of love. And so when he's talking about his love for her, in a way, he's also talking about his love for God. But he does a similar sort of thing as Dante on that, but he's more conflicted. He's a little worried about his sort of sexual and romantic interests. He feels like that's very intense and he finds it overwhelming, and he's a little worried that that's keeping him from going to heaven, basically, that he is too much in love and too drawn towards women to really be a proper religious moral person. So fascinating guy, Petrarch. And Petrarch is our nickname for him. His full name is Francesco Petrarca. But that's going to be true with a lot of these guys, is that we have a nickname that they're more familiar by. But yeah, he did a lot of work to kind of kickstart this whole movement. And so we can thank him for a lot of the sort of collection of knowledge and, encouraging other people to do the same thing. Some other guys who are really important. I mentioned Alberti. Ficino is a pretty cool guy. He translated Plato into Italian. By this time, Italian was a different language than Latin. And so he sort of reintroduced a lot of Plato's ideas. Plato wasn't as popular as Aristotle in the Middle Ages. And so he was bringing back some thoughts that had been kind of suppressed or downplayed or just not on people's minds all that much. And so he really got people thinking about Plato. And Plato is obsessed with what is a good government and how does that work? He has works like The Republic. So people saw a lot of relevance in that. We've got Pico della Mirandola. Pico is usually the nickname that people refer to him as. He really tried to learn both Hebrew writings, Greek writings, and also Latin writings. He thought that let's get our information from lots of different sources. So he studied Jewish stuff just as much as he studied Greek and Latin stuff. And he was actually kind of, he was a little bit of a dangerous figure to the church because he would debate some of the conventional philosophies and sort of argue that, no, I can disprove this. This isn't true. One idea he had that is still kind of lingered is this idea of a chain of being, that there's sort of a natural pattern to the universe. You start off with like the simplest, most sort of aggressive and unrefined animals, and like, maybe say bugs or something like that, or fish, and then you work your way up to like things that are more noble, like lions and things like that. And then finally you end up at the human being. And so the human being is at the end of the chain of being. And you've also got angels and demons. So demons are worse than animals, but angels are better than people. And then at the very top of the chain or end of the chain, depending on how you want to think of it, you have God. So Pico, this is part of humanism because he said there was something pretty noble about human beings if we could be right next to angels in that chain of being. He said that man had dignity and is only a little lower than the angels, which is pretty cool and a good philosophy for sort of being very encouraging and optimistic. Another scholar I want to mention is Laura Serreta. She wrote a work called The Defense of Liberal Instruction of Women, which liberal, means free. It's also connected to a certain body of knowledge called the liberal arts, which these guys were all about. All the sort of social sciences knowledge, but some mathematical knowledge and stuff too. So Laura Serreta is arguing that we should teach these things to women as well. She benefited from an education most women did not. And so she really put forth the idea that women and girls should be educated as well. And that's one of her claims to fame. She also wrote something like City of Women, in that it argued that there were great women throughout history and women had an inherent nobility to them as well as men. So that's pretty cool. And of course, all these people were coming from the upper class to some extent or another, the middle class or the upper class, working for these great competitive families. Another one I want to mention is Castiglione. I'm going to butcher that. I'm not good with Italian. Castiglione, he wrote the book on how to be a gentleman. And you got to imagine all these aristocrats were very interested in that topic. And his idea of being a gentleman was you should have this humanistic education in Latin and Greek, or he didn't even use the word humanistic, but this education in Latin and Greek and be learning about all these subjects. You should draw, you should communicate well, you should play music, and you should have grace. This is from his book of the courtier, which means someone in the sort of aristocratic court where everybody's hanging out and sort of competing with each other. He also recommended the same for women, but he didn't want women to be as learned. He said that would violate their soft and dainty tenderness. So, that was an idea that people followed, was that women should be educated differently. And that unfortunately had a little too much staying power. But I realize I've been talking for a while here. So those are some of our main philosophers. But next we're going to pick up with one of the most famous, which is a guy called Machiavelli. So that will be fun. See you in the next video.